Oh, no, it's all good. There's no, there's no
Martinez,
worries.
please interrupt us, because our the most comfortable way for us to educate or to share and run this workshop is actually the dialogue and communication. This is helps us both to move in the same direction, not just me and Sam moving in that direction. You're following, so please interrupt us anytime.
Sure, okay, no problems. Yeah, I'll just need to pop out for 10 minutes real quickly, because I have one step I forgot to do. So please take it away. I'm here.
That is totally
fine. Recording.
Cool.
All right, I'll be back soon.
Awesome. So I will just share my screen up so long, and we'll talk a little bit about what we've got so far. 1 second. And so last week we were kind of focusing on effects, kind of the fundamental effects, dynamic processing, EQ, and how to control the sonic image, if you will. I'm just gonna quickly share my audio as well. Give me 2 seconds.
Sam,
yes.
I think regarding latency, this previous method of streaming audio, last time we were streaming audio through the Zoom, yeah?
Yes.
But you did it just to be able to save the recording, isn't it?
Yes. So we have
Then doesn't matter. Because latency was big, but it's okay.
Okay. I'm just going to quickly stop the share again, because I have a black part on my Reaper for some reason. There's a missing section of my screen that I can't see. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, very strange. I'm just going to quickly reopen my Reaper. Oh, there we go. Sorted. Right. Let me reshare it. 1 sec. Back to Zoom. And share my screen. Would. Sorry, my laptop's being a little bit slow today. It's not having a great day. There we go. So what the plan is today is we're going to look a little bit more at going into kind of in-depth use of the plugin. So we talked about compression and automation and stuff, and now we're going to look at a kind of concept that sort of combines the two in an automatic way, which is called sidechain compression. And we're going to actually start using a bit more of these effects more in the actual production we have, rather than just talk about them and show examples. So I'll quickly explain roughly what sidechain is for everyone. Sidechain compression is basically compression that, so compression, the act of turning something down when it reaches a certain volume. But the input, the thing that it's looking at for the volume, is something different. So a really good example for this in podcasting is, for example, the vocals that we have, because they're the most important driver of information. That's where basically the whole narrative, everything comes from just the vocals. So you don't ever really want them to be obscured, but you want to be able to create immersion and build stuff around them. And a really nice, simple, and effective way to keep the important information clear and audible is to use sidechain compression over other elements. So that would mean you put the compressor onto a track with different elements, so like the ambiences, for example, and you select the input to come from the voice, whichever voice it is. So let me just open up the mix view here. If I go Command M and extend this up a little bit. So I think I already have a little setup that I will show us. And this is with Daniel. So we've not actually looked at his audio yet. We'll look a little bit more further on in today's session. But I've pre-set up so I can show you an example of how it's done and what it sounds like. So you can see here, these are your sends. So this section here is where you send audio to other tracks. And what that means is you internally route one part of the signal to an additional track or an additional internal part of the software. And then the bit above this line that you can see here, everything here are what you can call inserts or effects. It's essentially where we put effects, so the stuff we were talking about last time, like EQ, compression, etc. And you can see some of these little blocks are those effects. So, for example, here I have this one labeled Danik DJ set, and what this is some audio sampled from a recording of an event that he played. So you're going to find out a little bit more about him in a bit, but he's a DJ and producer from Ukraine.
Not a producer.
Oh,
No, he's a DJ and promoter.
DJ and promoter, sorry. And let me just go and find where he is. Let me just scroll along a little bit. Yeah, so this is his audio. And what you're going to see now when I hit play is that it might be a little delayed, so it might not sync up perfectly to notice it. But when his vocals come in, you're going to see this meter over here pulling down and having some little orange meters. And you should hear as well that whenever his voice comes in, the sound of the DJ set or the music gets quieter. Oh, one sec, I'm not hearing. Are you guys hearing that? Was it, is it silent for you?
I don't hear the sound.
Okay, let me just make sure it's, I think I might need to reset up the audio drivers. It should be set up to Zoom. Let me just hit apply and have a quick look. Seems to be a little issue with the audio drivers. One sec.
Sam, is it not on mute?
It shouldn't be, but let me just make sure. Let me check the full things. It's not muted. I don't see.
No. I see on the button now.
He's happy. I think it's just simply. Let me just check a few different audio drivers. So I guess it's a good way of testing to see where the problem is in terms of if at home you have the same problem and you're hitting play and you're not getting any audio. You can open up the system preferences and check. These are your different drivers that we have. So we've talked a bit about them before, but I'm going to check here built-in output again, just to check. Now, you won't hear this at home, but it's just for me to be able to check if it's something wrong with my software or something wrong with Zoom. Okay, so I'm hearing it. That's totally fine. I think it's a little bit of an issue with the Zoom audio. So when I apply the Zoom, it seems to cause silence. What I'm going to...
Do you hear when you play?
No, I don't hear it at all
right.
either. It just completely kills it, which is very strange because this has never happened with the Zoom drivers before. But I know they can be a little bit temperamental. Let me just stop sharing one more final time and start again, just to see if that fixes it.
Absolutely, yeah.
My Zoom seems to be glitching out, actually. Maybe that's the issue. My meeting seems to think it's closed. Here we go. Screen share. I think it might just be a tick box. Ah, there we go. Share computer sound. I just didn't have this defaulted back to having a certain part unticked. Cool. That should work out. Now if I hit play, let's see.
6 years, beginning like in 2016. I just fell in love in it somehow.
Yes,
perfect default. Okay, great. So I will pull that back up again for 2 minutes so we can see. And here, for some reason, I'm sorry for the graphics. I think the screen shares caused Reaper to be a little bit glitchy today. So again, here, this is the compressor that's acting over. Oh, sorry, no, this is the wrong compressor. This is the compressor that's acting over the DJ set, so the sound of kind of music-y club. And now here, when you see him speaking, this is Danik, this is his voice. You'll see some output gain reduction or turning down of volume.
My name is Daniel. I'm from the great city of Lviv in Western Ukraine. I'm like doing the DJing for the last.
So now if I bypass this, so I'm just going to take the threshold all the way back up to 0. You should hear that the music is now suddenly louder and interfering more with his voice.
My name is Daniel. I'm from the great city of Lviv in Western Ukraine. I'm like doing the DJing for the last 6 years, beginning like in 2016.
So I don't know if you guys can hear that, because for me, I'm getting still a lot of choppiness from just the Zoom audio drivers in general. I don't know if it's also clipping for you guys with little pops and clicks all over the place.
I've heard something, but I thought maybe this is just because of conflict of the frequencies, because the field is busy, plus the recording of party. I mean, this is not a stereo recording. This is like a,
Yeah, it's like a...
It's not a mixed recording.
No, exactly. So
Yeah,
it is dodgy, but the clicks and pops shouldn't be there. I think the clicks and pops are coming from audio driver problems, but I might not be able to sort it just because it's inherent to Zoom's sort of way, and it's the only way to have the audio for the recording. So
Is the sample rate is okay, Jacob asking?
Yeah, the sample, it's at 48, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be happy. I think Zoom also works at 48,000. Yeah, so it's 48. I'm just going to make it requested just to make sure it's at the correct one.
And
oh, that seemed to fix it for now, at least. So, okay, we've had a little look at that sidechain compression. So now we're going to actually do it in real time so you can see what it does, because it's a little bit weird in Reaper and a little bit tricky, but we will get the hang of it. So I'm just going to bring back up the mixer view here. But before I do, this region here, so this is Victor's vocals, which we've already had a look at in the previous times. And this is the city ambience we brought in last time. So what we're going to do, the plan is
Victor is a tourist guide that I talked before. Just there,
yeah.
He's a tourist guide, and this is the story about about him.
Perfect. So the plan is to try and use his voice to trigger the compression or turning down the volume of the ambience that we have here. So the ambience sounds like this, just so you guys know. So it's kind of city touristy noise because he's talking about tour guides and tourism, etc. And his voice is doing this.
Hobby that became a profession that became a.
So what we'll do, if I do Command M, I just bring up the lower mixer view here, and what we want to do is put the compressor plugin over here. So I'm going to take away the one we currently have, just because we want to start from total scratch. One sec there. So what I'm going to do is put a compressor here on the city ambience that he has. So if I go over here and I select Recomp, and I hit add, you see it shows up there, and you get the little compressor effect that we had before. Now the next thing I'm going to do is go to Victor's vocals, and you can see here, I'm going to add a send. And basically, like we said before, the sends are sending some of the signals, so for example, Victor's vocals, to that channel, to the city ambience channel. So what we need to do, and this is the bit that's a little bit more tricky, is we add a send here, and we're going to select city ambience here. So we'll select city ambience, but what we need to do is change the the city ambience to a new receiving track, and we go 3/4. And basically what this is doing is saying that it's making more inputs to this channel, and it's maybe a little bit more complex than you need to know, but just so it makes sense why we're selecting that. If we select just 1 and 2, you're going to start hearing both the city ambience and his voice over the single channel. So if you hit solo, you would hear both of them, and that means you kind of stuck. You can't mix them. If you turn one down, you turn the other down, etc. So by selecting the parent channels, it's kind of a unique to Reaper thing, but by selecting 3 and 4, we can then go over to the compressor in a minute and select some additional inputs called auxiliary inputs, and that way it'll take the input, but you're not going to actually hear it doubling between the two tracks. So we've done that send. Now the other thing that I'm going to change, and this is also maybe a bit kind of confusing, but it's also pretty important, is to make the send. So you have this little drop-down menu that says post fader, post pan, and make it pre-effects. And what this is doing is essentially it's telling the send where to take the signal from. Because, for example, you can see we can put effects on the voice. We can compress it or EQ it, or change all these sort of things with effects, and also change the volume with the fader. But if we are taking the source, the trigger input from the post fader, it's called position, like after it's gone through all the processing and everything, it's going to change how the compression happens. Because, for example, if you finish everything and go, actually, his voice is a little bit too loud, and pull it down, you're going to then also pull down the amount of signal being sent to the compressor, which will change how much compression is happening, etc. So by selecting pre-effects, it means before anything happens, at the very, very beginning of it going into the channel, the audio, Victor's vocals, it's going to send that signal as the input to the compressor. So I also send it at 0. You can see 0 dB here, just so it's stuck at the same level. It doesn't change. And that's all you need to do in terms of setting up the send on Victor's channel. So you can see now you see it's show up here, city ambience, and you can actually see that little wheel shows the amount of send, and you can adjust it. We'll just leave it like that for a minute. So now the next thing to do in here is to open up. This is the compressor that we've inserted here on the city ambience. And as you can see, we have this detector input section. So we've got auxiliary inputs, main, left, right, auxiliary, left, right, feedback, and output. Now, what you want to do is select the auxiliary input for any sidechain related stuff in Reaper. You basically are saying, look at the channel 3-4 that we made over here. And it was a little bit kind of confusing as to why. And to be honest, I don't really know why Reaper does it like this because it's not very intuitive. But now when we hit play, you're going to see that these meters here, these little green bars, they're linked not to the city ambience, but to Victor's voice. So they're going to go up when Victor's voice goes up and down when Victor's voice goes down, rather than the city ambience like before.
Hobby that became a profession, that became a passion.
So you can see there, it's now taking the input from his voice. So I'm going to just close the mixer again and keep this up and unsolo his voice as well for a minute. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hit play, and I'm going to pull down I'm going to put the ratio up a little bit like we talked about last time, and I'm going to pull the threshold down while he's speaking until I start to hear him nice and clearly. And basically what that's doing is telling us how much compression to actually apply to the ambience that we have, that city noise.
During my degree, I got into a special course for tour guides. And I started sightseeing tours. I'm now doing this for 10 years. It's a hobby that became a profession, that became a passion. So
I'm also going to extend the release here, because what I can hear, so by pulling the release, it means that it's a bit more natural volume pulling rather than really aggressive changes. It makes them a bit more fluid and smooth. So I've just made it quite a slow release, nearly 1 second's worth of release time. And yeah, just to recap from last week as well, the release time is how long after this level here, these little green meters go below the threshold, how long after that the compressor takes to start putting it back to the volume it originally was and get rid of that volume reduction essentially. So now if I hit play here, we will see what it sounds like, and I can bypass it here with this little tip.
My small passion. I won't give you the huge riptide of dates and historical figures, but I will tell you what to drink, what to eat, that we have a corrupted mayor and so on. So my main goal is turning cats into locals, maybe for 2 hours, maybe for a day or a weekend. But
so I'm guessing you guys should be able to hear that through there. I know the latency is a little bit dodgy, so it might be hard to line up the two. But that is kind of the basis of how you do sidechain. And I use sidechain all over the place. It's one of my favorite ways of creating more headspace, essentially, or headroom in a mix. Because like we were talking before about the sonic image you have, essentially. By doing this, you're taking away stuff that's not needed from the image, and you're giving yourself more space so that each element has more impact, or you have space for more additional elements. And I kind of think about, in terms of like a creative process, if I'm sound designing something, I think about that space and what the different effects do. So for example, using something like sidechain compression helps create more space and more headroom, and it takes elements away from the mix in quite a transparent way. You don't really notice it as aggressively most of the time. Whereas, for example, reverb, like we looked at a little bit ago, that actually adds to the mix, and you can almost think of it as adding like a fine haze. So we talked about the objects, for example, your vocal, which has a depth to it and a height to it and a width to it. And what reverb essentially does is it kind of takes that and then blurs the lines of that object to the point that it's almost like creating a gradient of shade around the stereo field. And that's why in my head, because I work really reductively with how I sound design things or how I build mixes, I'm much more careful with anything that adds to that sonic image, and I tend to try and use it as sparsely as possible or as intently as possible. I won't just throw a reverb on something because I want reverb. I will think about how I can use it to function the best way as possible while still adding the least amount of haze, because by doing that, you're also kind of losing your definition. But yeah, I tend to use sidechain all over stuff, both from like a musical perspective, but also from post-production or podcasting related stuff, because it cleans up things really nicely.
I would really like to learn from you this approach of reasonable consideration, because I'm highly addicted to reverb and delay. It's just like, oh my God, I cannot get enough.
No, I understand. I feel like with reverb and delay, in both a musical context, but also just a sound design context in podcasting, they can be really satisfying because they're the easiest to hear. When you put a reverb on, it's very hard to miss it. And we also associate that kind of sound with grandeur, etc. The thing with those effects is that half the time you're actually not necessarily hearing it as better, you're hearing it as different. And I guess it's a good way of training your mind to see whether you just have something that's now different to what you had, or whether it's still serving the exact function of what you wanted it to be when you made it. And it's kind of hard to do that, because I also still find myself, if I'm making, I don't know, for example, here, like a big explosion sound, it's very easy to put a reverb on and go, yeah, that sounds good because it sounds so big and dominating. But actually, I need to kind of in my head have a little checklist of making sure, am I actually creating what I wanted to before I started throwing effects on? Or did I just start throwing effects on and then go, oh, I have suddenly a totally different sound that I think sounds cool, but is not functioning in the way that it was supposed to at all?
Sam, would you find it applicable for a podcast genre technique that we get taught in uni, if you remember, about using the reverb, like room ambience for a reverb? Like as some particular spaces that actually reflects, like it's thousands of them, like churches, like and other things, that can actually accommodate like straight ahead, more or less, without digging deep into playing with all of those reverb effects. I'm just thinking ahead about how, for example, Carrie can apply it, and skip the improvisational and exploration, not skip, but like maybe a little bit decrease the time of exploration, maybe find something that may save her some time, and just like I, for example, as from my music and audio production, one of my main rules that I've learned like a long time ago is steal as an artist, and it's from a famous book about the graphic arts. But what it's trying to say is like we always reproduce, we recreate something that has already been created, and even though individualism in a particular own sound is very nice and important nowadays, however, our modern tools also allows us to save time in some fields while still developing the original creative idea. And maybe something like that would be also applicable for a podcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. So with podcasting, the one thing to remember, we'll talk a little bit as well today about like podcasting formats, but the stereotypical podcast, when you think of like Spotify type podcast, is they usually have a very dry vocal. So for what you would call either like interview podcast, where it's two people having a conversation in a room, there's plenty of ones like that, or solo podcasting where it's just one person talking about something, generally it's not used. That doesn't mean it couldn't be used, and it could be really cool. But where, for example, it could be very, very interesting is you have things called theatrical podcasts. You can kind of categorize them at, and it's essentially what radio drama was. It's a full fiction script with actors, voice actors, reenacting it. And for those sort of things, it's very important to have, because especially since you don't have the visual cue, say if you have like a radio drama and there's supposed to be a scene in a church or in a beach or in all these different environmental spaces, it's very important not just to have the ambience. For example, if it's a church, to have the kind of church ambience of whatever that might be, mild praying in the background or etc. But equally, and maybe even more importantly, is to be able to place the voice in the sound of that environment. So using we don't, I think, unfortunately, it doesn't come stock with Reverb, but using something like an impulse response reverb, which I won't explain exactly what it is because it's very complicated, but it's basically a really accurate way of modeling a space, like an exact real space in real life. So there's plenty of third-party plugins that you can use for that sort of that goal. And the important thing is to use them also sparingly. So we have the wet dry when we talk about reverb, like we said before. And you might seem like the best thing to do in that case is to just use the wet
to the top.
Yeah, the wet one all the way to the top and dry all the way to the bottom. But that's just going to make it sound incredibly unnatural, and you're going to mess with your speech intelligibility. So you really want to blend between the two, the wet and the dry. I can show you if I open up the little mixer here that, let me scroll over for a second. We've got a little reverb bus here. So this is the reverb, the stock reverb of Reaper. But as you can see, we've got the wet and the dry. And by blending with these, this is the unprocessed signal, and this is the processed signal. So this here is the reverb, essentially. And if you were putting it discrete to a channel, instead of on a bus like we have here, you would want to be blending between the original signal and the wet signal so that it sounds kind of natural and realistic. And also for this sort of format podcast, we could maybe get away with doing that sort of placing voices in a space. But again, it's kind of tricky because of the quality of the recordings, because we've used them through Zoom calls, through Zencaster. Trying to place them in a natural space is going to sound weird because you can kind of hear that they were recorded through an online source. You know, it sounds like a computer microphone, which isn't a problem. But I would say that most of the time, if you're going for that kind of effect of trying to realistically place someone in a room, you probably want to have recorded them in a controlled environment with a kind of proper mic, mic'd up correctly, etc. Because otherwise you're going to start amplifying and affecting weird, I don't know, alien sounds like clicks and pops that you get from just general online video calls. And it will probably more than likely detract from the realism that you're trying to get, if that's your goal. If you're using it for a total sound design thing, like we're going to look at automating reverb. In fact, now is maybe a good time to do that here, just to show it. Then it can be a bit more creative. You can get away with not being realistic, being a bit more ethereal or pseudo-realistic. So,
Sam,
yeah.
Jacob have a question in the chat.
Yes.
Would it be right to say you can use Foley in place of reverb at times as well?
Foley, did you say? Sorry.
Yeah.
So in terms of like building that realism image, by having really well done Foley, it can actually mean that you don't necessarily need the reverb. And it's totally a stylistic thing, I think, because, for example, you can use, if you're using that reverb, that realistic reverb, we'll call it, to place the vocal, you're probably still going to be sacrificing some speech intelligibility. If you think of the difference between a radio presenter speaking through a microphone super clearly and up front at the very front of your stereo image, compared to someone talking to you from 10 meters away in a church, you know, as an example, they're a lot less clear, their articulation is a lot less clear. So say, for example, if you were making some sort of theater-based podcast and it was really important, you wanted the audience to hear every single element, I would use heavy Foley and ambient sounds to create more of that environment with a very subtle bit of reverb, just because otherwise you're going to lose that important dialogue. And especially when you have no visual cues and you miss the dialogue, or, you know, in any context of audio, you miss that important information, it kind of defeats the purpose of having the voice there in the first place. So I think a really good way of thinking about approaching building audio and mixes is about what is the functional role of the thing? Like in this section of a song, in this section of a podcast, in this section of a movie soundtrack, any of them, what is the most important element, or what is the element that is driving forward to the next section or the next part or the next, next whatever. And that really, at least for me, I found thinking like that makes you so much better at making decisions from a mixing standpoint, because you're not thinking, oh, but I can make this so much cooler if I put a bunch of reverb on all these weird little telephone sounds that are not that important, and you actually spend your time focusing on the really important stuff, and then usually you end up doing less, which has much more of an effect. You do less to the more important things, and they actually, you hear the impact rather than do 100 different processes that are all counterintuitive to each other, you know what I mean? So what we can do here, just to have a little look at how you would, for example, automate reverb creatively. So this is not to put it in a space to seem realistic, but we have this section here. So I'm just going to play this this little transition, and basically what I feel is that the line ends quite abruptly, but I like the kind of unknown to it. But then to be able to have a transition to the next line, I think it's nice to have that pause. But in that pause, if there's nothing, it's maybe a bit uncomfortable. So I'll just play the ending of Victoria's section, going into the start of Victor's. And the plan is we're going to do a little reverb swell here so that this gap is filled by the reverb of his voice. So
message the relatives and saying that war started.
We woke up with my girlfriend, and she told me, okay, the war started. And I was just, wow, that's impossible. That cannot be. I'm sure it's just, and I remember the first day of war.
So you can kind of hear the bit that I want to reverb out myself is this kind of umming and ahhing, because I think it really highlights the kind of confusion of what he's actually talking about, you know, waking up and suddenly being in a country that's at war, and the kind of shock element. But in order to transition it, because we're not doing a traditional format where it's like two people interviewing and asking questions, I can't, for example, have me asking questions. So what did you do at the start of the war, or anything like that? So we need to be a bit more creative. And in this case, I'm going to be using, I guess, sound design and like creative effects to fill those gaps and make it a bit more, it's a little bit more experimental, but I also think it can be a bit more impactful rather than like what you see is what you get. Here's me asking a question, here's an answer.
Okay.
But that's just my own personal taste format with podcasts. But so to automate in Reaper, we already had a little look at it, but now we're going to actually use it in the context of the production. So we have this little trim button here. So that's the envelopes. And you can see you bring up all the different track envelopes. Now, I think I already have set up. In fact, let me check for a second. So as you can see before this, what I've done on Victor's channel is there's a reverb send. So by doing that, I just clicked here. Oh, sorry, there. And I added a new send under reverb. I scrolled to the bottom and I selected reverb. And as you can see, I've already done that. And it's this one here. But I pulled the send level, so it defaulted to here. I pulled it all the way down to here, because what we want is we don't want the reverb on all the time. We want his vocal to be dry, but over just this little section where he's going and ah, we want to ramp it up so that essentially that send level is going increased, and then we pull it back down to stop before his next vocals come in. So what we do is we open the trim track, and you can see you've got send envelopes here. So we've got reverb, send, volume. That's simple as that. You just do a little tick and you get this little line appear at the bottom. So we will close that again for a second. And now I'm just going to play it again, and we're going to hear where he starts kind of humming. You can almost hear him, I guess, thinking in a way.
Cannot be. I'm sure it's just.
So from this little nodule you can see, which is this one here, I'll zoom in a little bit. It's like I just need to move our heads to in the way. There we go. So from this little nodule here is kind of where he starts going and what I do is you go over to that area, and here I'm going to right click and go. Oh, no, for some reason it's not. Insert point. There we go. And then I'm going to insert another point here because I want it to be totally. It's not letting me again. So yeah, insert point. And then finally, I'm going to put one over here, insert point. So what this is going to do, once I pull this up, it's going to make a nice little triangle shape. Oh, unfortunately, my laptop is very unhappy today. So as you can see, as I pull this up, you have this little triangle. And this is the send level, you can call it, or the imaginary fader that we have in that send going up, and then it reaches this point, and then it goes down. So now if I hit play, I'm going to make it a little bit more extreme just so we can definitely hear it. But
I'm sure it's just. And I remember the first day of work.
So as you can hear from that, you hear it kind of suddenly die away. You hear it swell up over that section. I might push it a little bit more because it's quietish and it could be a bit more extreme. And then it fades back down. But we'll talk a little bit more just to show you more ways of doing automation, but also ways of doing it creatively. So the thing with this is that you still actually hear the reverb tail when it's coming over, because what this is sending it to the effect, but you're not controlling the level of the effect. So what we can do is if we scroll down to the reverb bus now, you see we've got this reverb bus. I'm just going to open them up a little bit as well so we can see the options. We've also got the trim option. So we can open this trim and we can actually just put volume over here. And if we automate the volume, what we can, it's defaulted to 0, which is where we want it. We want it to be at the full 0. But we can just make it dip in volume for a little bit over here so that we can control how the reverb fades out. And it just gives you the ability to kind of be more intentional with your reverb tails or the volumes of your reverb. And what I'm also doing is I don't think that necessarily for this whole section, the reverb needs to be tailing, because I want it to kind of die off maybe around here. So you have a minute of silence or a second of silence before the next vocal comes in. So if I go down here and I just simply pull this down here and I pull it all the way to 0, just like this here. It's not quite at 0, it just takes a bit of pulling. There we go. So now you should hear that we have the reverb come up and then it starts fading away because this is the volume of the reverb. So this is the amount of signal of Victor's voice we're sending to the reverb. It's going to the effect, and this is the actual effect, and this is the volume of the effect, or the volume of the reverb going down, down, down. And then what we're going to do is I'll add another little point here, and we'll just keep it at 0 for a minute because then you won't hear it fade back up or anything. So if we just do this, it takes a lot of pulling. Minus infinity, minus infinity. And you can just see here in this box, when you click on points, you see there's a yellow box and it shows you the minus infinity dB at blah, blah, blah. You can use that if you want to be very particular about your effects. But now if I hit play, let's have a little listen.
It's just, and I remember the first.
So that's the idea of it. It's a little bit unnatural for me, so I would maybe put another point in here and just drag it so that it doesn't die away as fast. It's kind of has a bit of a slower slope and then a faster slope. And it's kind of like the same idea as shaping the fades that we were doing when we were cutting audio files, like this fade here. So now we'll play it one more time.
It's just.
It's still a little bit abrupt, so I'm actually just take away this point as well. I'm just going to go delete point. And now that makes that a bit smoother. And it is very much, I guess, trial and error when it comes to doing this, because there's no way you can kind of know. You get a feel for what automation lines should look like, but in the context, it's always about just shaping them over a bit of time.
It's just... And I remember the first day of work.
So that's a little bit more natural to me. And it's also, again, a reductive process. Like we were talking about the idea of whenever I do something, it's always about how can I take away from that image? How can I make more space? By doing this, it's removing. So this is adding, but it's something I intentionally wanted because this space needs something. But by doing this, and then again, controlling the stereo image and making the impact that has a little bit less and giving it a little bit more headroom and a little bit more space for elements when they come back in. And it kind of also, I guess, makes his vocal when it re-enters a little bit more impactful because you have a second of silence before it. So now I'm just gonna untick the visible line here. There we go. And now if we scroll back up, you see the send line has disappeared. And then if I go here, and I untick the volume to be visible, it goes away. So that's just, once you've done with the reverbs and you don't want to have hundreds of lanes, they're called lanes, of those drawn lines essentially, you just click on the little trim function and you can click visible or invisible. So now if I wanted to edit again, I can just go in here and it shows up. I can tweak it and then just make it invisible for another minute. So that's kind of the main bulk of automation. Are there any questions or things that I've skipped over very quickly, or any confusions at all with automation or volume automation and send automation? No. Cool, that's all good then. I've explained it nicely. So before we go into the other effects, just so I don't overload you with random technicality stuff, I'll talk about another little feature in Reaper that can be useful for podcast editing that's we've not really used, and I don't always use it, but it can be useful, especially if it's the way you would like to work. So there's a thing in Reaper here, you can find it if you go File, Edit, Dynamic Split. So if you open this, and essentially what this is, if you've ever worked with any other audio software, in Pro Tools it's called Beat Detective, and I just don't remember the names in other softwares, but it's basically detecting the sounds and giving you the ability, for example, it's kind of designed for working with drums if you wanted to cut every single drum beat up. But what we can use it for is to actually cut sections of audio. So as you can see, I have this section of Danik, which I pre-edited, and you can see there's little gaps of silence here. And this is where I've strung together some of his phrases to be a little section and another little section. Now, if I click this, you can see all these hundreds of little lines appear. So I'm just going to show you through the kind of controls of it and then how we can get it to work in a more subtle way, because right now this is looking at cutting every single word, essentially. So what we have is we have this threshold here, which determines how quiet it needs to be before it cuts. But it's still a little bit too much. Like if I zoom in a bit, I'll make his track a bit bigger so you guys are not squinting completely. Like this, and now if I click it, and you can still see there's hundreds and hundreds of little ticks. So what else I can do is actually create a minimum slice length and make it fairly long. You know, this is the minimum size it has to be, and silence length, so the minimum amount of silence. And by controlling these, you can kind of tweak it to cut out the silent bits. Now, it's not quite designed for this, so it might take a bit of tweaking. And if I click reduce splits, it's being a little bit funny. I was doing it earlier today and it was managing to actually cut it perfectly, but for some reason this one is now no longer happy. Remove silence areas. Yeah. Nothing, the settings seem to be identical. It just seems to be significantly more sensitive, but nothing has changed. Unless that, here we go. This looks much closer, but it's still significantly less sensitive. More sensitive than it was. Stretch. Yeah, it's very strange. So I might not be able to actually do it because it will cut it, but essentially I'll do it and then I will undo the process. You can see what it does. So if I hit split, it's going to suddenly, you see it's made all these little cuts. So normally, for some reason, it's being far too sensitive, but normally it would allow me to just make cuts over these regions. So for example, here and here and here and here, and just allow me to strip the silence really quickly, which means I then have the blocks to work with. But for some reason, it is not wanting to play ball today, so that is totally fine. 2 seconds. So the next thing we'll actually look at doing then is have a quick look at EQ and how to actually bring it into the session we're doing. So we talked about what it is last time, but we didn't really use it intentionally with the stuff we currently have. So what we can do is, I'm going to play, because some of you guys have not heard the actual arrangement, I'm going to play the first little 5 minutes or so. I just go from here. So the intro with some of the sound effects we have, and a little bit up until the city ambience, just so you can hear the layering we've got going on, etc. And then from there, we can maybe have a think about what elements feel like they're clashing with the vocals or anything like that, and then we can apply EQ to treat them. So let's go from the beginning. It'll let me.
I think
My name is Victoria. I'm from Donetsk. I left my home in 2014, and from that point, I have started my journey. Now I'm working as a designer, and I'm continue my journey. Now I'm in Malaga city, it's Spain. As I already said, I have left my native town in 2014, but my parents didn't want to leave their flat, their home. It was hard for them, and it's still hard for them now. And they are now in safe, and I'm really glad for them because, like, it was a very dangerous situation. They moved 2 days before a bomb fell down in the train station. Okay, I woke up because of some sound of bomb, or I don't know. It was 4:30 a.m. And then on my balcony, tank crossing the street. I was crying really, and like in a 5 minutes, all the people throughout our country started to message their relatives and saying that war started. War started.
we woke up with my girlfriend, and she told me, "Okay, the war started." And I was just, "Wow, that's impossible. That cannot be." I'm sure it's just. And I remember the first day of war. What should I do?
Okay, so that's just the first intro bit for those of you who've not heard it at all. And what we can have a look at doing is using EQ to clean up some of the sound design bits here. So in the sound effects section mainly, I think there's a little bit of masking going on, for example, especially with the tank driving. When the tank driving happens over Victoria's speaking, it doesn't obscure it to the point that you can't hear it, but it makes it a bit harder to hear. And one way we can do that is to turn the volume down, which might also be the best way. But what we can do first, as another way of reductive processing, is cut some of the frequency content out of the tank sound that is in the vocal. So if we play it again, we can have a little listen, just have a see where you feel like her voice disappears.
Tank crossing the street. I was crying really, and like in a 5 minutes, all the people.
So to me, there's a little section here that I kind of hear her voice just get slightly less clear. And what I'm going to do is if I open up the mixer and we go over to the tank, which is here, tank driving, and we can add up in the effects bit, so you can just click these little boxes and we scroll through and look for the re-EQ, and that's like the stock Reaper EQ, just so everyone has it, everyone can use it. And now we've got these bands, and we've already had a little look at how it works. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just grab this one, and I'm going to pull it, I'm going to cut it, and just pull it around kind of this region while the tank is going, and we'll play it a few times. And we're just going to listen for when it still sounds, it has the impact of what we want, the tank with the kind of larger stature, but equally her voice is just a bit clearer and just pops out a little bit better. So let me just play it again, and we'll have a test.
On my balcony, tank crossing the street. I was crying really, and like in a 5 minutes.
So I'm going to play that again, but I think it's kind of somewhere around this 1K region, because her voice is a little bit higher pitched than the tank noise in general. So I think in terms of the way I think about the process, keeping this bit here clear, not necessarily cutting 50 hertz, 20 hertz, 300, even maybe 500, because her voice is definitely not going to be in those regions, the main part we're focusing on. So it creates the own space so we can still keep the size of the tank, you know, the imaginary size. You feel how big and dominating it is in a way, by having this low end kept and not cutting it. The main thing we're going to focus on, because her voice sits in it, is the mid-range, which is, yeah, kind of exactly where this cut is. And then equally, there is a bit of top end. Her voice and the tank might clash in, but I think it's going to be much less than it's going to be clashing in this region. So what we'll do is we'll play it one more time, and I'm going to now just adjust the bandwidth here, which is basically, if I do it, you'll see the tightness of what that cut looks like. So if I play it again.
Tank crossing the street. I was crying really, and like in 5 minutes, all the people throughout our tank crossing the street. I was crying really, and like in 5 minutes.
So yeah, that's again, it's quite a big cut, I would say, in general, like a 9 dB cut, but it's quite a subtle effect that you hear. If I solo the tank and then bypass the effect and unbypass it, you'll hear the difference. So this is it before the processing we did. One sec, if it lets me. And this is the effect with the little subtle EQ. So you can hear solo that has like a little bit less of an impact, etc. But you're not actually noticing that when it's played together in the whole mix, because her voice is already filling that region, and it just means you don't have two conflicting sound sources fighting. And kind of making these decisions is essentially a way of defining the important elements and making them translate from a mix perspective. Because even, I guess, something that's really easy to fall in when you make your own work, when you're the one creating it, isn't knowing in your head, oh yeah, that's important, and I know exactly what she said because I've heard it 20 times over when I was editing it and putting it together. So I know that I can hear those words because I've pre-heard them. But when someone else who's not heard it at all listens to it, they might not be able to actually listen to it as articulately because they've not heard it 50 times before it was obscured with a tank noise. So I think it's kind of, it can be difficult at the beginning, but it's important to spend a bit of time thinking, how does the audience or a person who's never heard this before, what are they actually going to hear when they play it back? Are they going to hear, wow, that tank is really loud and I can't hear what you're saying? Or are they going to hear, actually, that tank is a really nice volume and it adds to the storyline, but it's still, I can completely hear everything she's saying and I didn't have to focus a bit harder or anything. And it's like a fine balance, and it just takes a little bit of time. So the other thing that I think could do with a bit of tweaking, and this might not be EQ specific, this might be a combination of EQ, potentially reverb or compression, but all these phone call noises. So I like the phone call noises, but they're just a little bit abrasive to me. So I'll play them again and you'll hear.
People throughout our country started to message their relatives and saying that what.
So you can hear that we've got these phone sounds pinging all over the place. And I think part of it might be a volume thing, but also part of it, again, like we were talking about the voices before with that realistic reverb, I think they just feel a little bit unrealistic because they're the pure tone and you're not hearing them in a space. Whereas when you normally hear a phone, for example, you're hearing it on a table in a room, or you're hearing it, you never just hear the pure sound of the phones. So what we can do here, let's have a look, because I'm not actually sure of the different reverbs that come stock with Reaper. And I just want to use stock just so that everyone's on the same playing field and I'm not using a bunch of stuff people don't have. So we have reverb, and I think there's a second one they have. So let me just have a look. Limit, pitch, streams, and tune verb. Okay, so there's two. There's reverb and reverberate. And the one we've currently seen is, let me just check, I think it's reverb. No, it's reverberate that we've seen. So let's put reverb on and see what the difference is between the two. And I can maybe have a little explanation as well. Okay, this is an impulse response. This is an impulse response reverb, but I'm not sure if it gives us any impulse responses. Let's see what sweet verbo is. So these essentially are files called impulse response files. So if you're wanting to mess around with it, you can probably find a whole load online through Reddit or free sample library stuff. And you can bring them in and use it exactly like this. So sweet verbo actually looks like a real reverb. That bad crunch, I think, is some kind of very distorted kind of effecty type thing that's not actually a reverb. So as you can see here, we've got the same controls again, wet and dry. And then we've got the width of the reverb, like we talked before. So how big an area it smears in your stereo image. You can kind of think of it like that. And then a pre-reverb, which we'll talk about, but it's essentially a delay for the reverb. So let's just have a play of these phone sounds real quick. And I'm just going to tweak the wet dry while they're happening to see what it sounds like. So I've just put this over the entire bus. Remember when we first made them, we created a subfolder for all those sound effects, and all the phone sounds here go to the messages bus. So I've put this reverb on the messages bus, and you can see there it says messages.
People throughout our country started to message their relatives and saying that war started.
So this is a very big reverb, which is kind of not the size we wanted. So it might not be the best, but I'm also going to pull the width down because it's just a bit big. Like when you hear that, it's very sparkly. It almost sounds like a Sonic game or something, collecting tokens rather than phones going off. So I'm going to make it a lot narrower and taking the width down. Impulse response generation. I'm going to take the echo generator off and just leave it as a reverb generator. I'm not sure what this will necessarily sound like. And then I'm going to bring the wet down even a little bit more. So it's very subtle. Let's have a listen.
People throughout our country started to message their relatives and saying that people throughout our country started to message their relatives and saying that war.
So that's a bit better to me. It's a bit more natural. It's not perfect, I would say. I'd still like to work on a little bit more. And it might be a case of equally putting some EQ. So let me just try this and take a little bit of that top end off, because in my head I'm still very much hearing it like a video game sound, kind of in a way. I'm hearing something very computery processed, which even though almost all phone noises are, I don't associate them with that in the real world. So I'm just going to add here another re-EQ after the reverb. So we talked about signal flow and chains of effects. So we've got reverb, and now I'm going to EQ the reverberated signal a little bit. And I think what it's probably going to be is me just pulling the top end down. So I'm going to use this high shelf. So you can see it's set to high shelf. And when you pull that down, it doesn't do the U shape like this one does. If I do that, it does more of a straight line. So let me just put this back to 0. Okay, so I'm going to keep this at 0 as well. And then while we play it, I'm going to pull it down and see what it does.
People throughout our country started to message their relatives and saying that war started.
Let's try again.
People throughout our country started to message their relatives and saying that war started.
So to me, that's already taken a bit of the kind of video game-esque element out of it. And it's kind of these small iterative decisions that I think make the bigger effect when you're coming to both sound design and mixing as a kind of general whole. But that's maybe a good way of showing you like the practical applications of reverb, and especially in podcasting, I think the best way to bring it in is thinking about how to make things stand out rather than using them like you would maybe in a musical context, which is to make them sound better. I think it's much more about using them in a corrective way. You know, this has too much of that. This is masking this or covering that sound, rather than, oh, this could sound so much better if I boosted a bunch of top end. But again, there's no rules. I would say it's all contextual. If you're doing something and you think it needs that, then it's great to do, like to do whatever the creative impulse is. But are there any wee questions to do with EQ or anything at all? Just questions burning in anyone's mind?
No, it's intense informational. So it's just like, you know.
That's all good. Well, maybe what we can do is take a little 15-minute break or so, if everyone's up for that, and come back at 2:30, and we'll just resume going through some stuff, if that sounds good.
It's 12:30 in UK, guys.
Oh yeah, sorry, I just looked at my laptop. 12:30 UK.
It's about back in Europe. That's fine.
Perfect, cool. So,
Sam,
yes.
Jacob have a question about could you overuse a multi-band compressor? So just think about it for to talk after the break, yeah?
Perfect, yeah, when I come back. Just remind me in case I forget, but I'm sure I'll remember. Cool.
I will. But yeah, guys, you can mute yourself, but just don't leave the Zoom call, you know, if you could just remain in the call and just mute it, and we'll be back in 15 minutes, yeah?
Perfect, cool. See you guys in a wee second. Perfect. So before the break, Jacob had a question, and was it, if you could just read it out again, Eugene, just so I've got the exact wording. I can find it here.
Sorry, what?
Oh yeah, could you overuse a multiband compressor? There we go. So I'll quickly explain just multiband compression in general for 2 minutes, so that anyone at home or who doesn't know what it is. One more second, actually, sorry. Yes, so multiband compression is essentially a combination of EQ and compression. What it does is it turns down the volume of specific frequencies. So like you could set the compressor to turn down certain loud peaks. For example, when something's too loud, in an overall volume, it's just the voice is too loud. With the multiband, you can use it to turn down specific sections, so the mid-range or the top end of that vocal. And it's a really good way of being very precise with what you remove from a signal. So instead of just turning all the volume down, you can turn down just a little subset of frequencies, and you're not destroying the sound as much, which is especially important for things like voice, where you don't want maybe the whole voice to dip, but you want small sections of it to lose frequency content to create space for other elements that might come in. So with a multiband compressor, overusing it, what it will do is create no dynamic range internally with your with that frequency level. So it can become quite unnatural sometimes if you have, for example, a vocal and you rarely multiband compress the mid-range, which is where most of the speech intelligibility comes from, the sound of the voice. But the problem with that is that you're not actually compressing the other sides, which becomes your top end and your low end. So you could create kind of weird plosives, which are like the stuff, like pops and tongue noise and stuff like that, because they're going to be allowed to still be very dynamic while you've made that middle section much more restrictive. You know, you've made it, when we were talking about the apparent volume levels, like the depth of the object, you've made the mid-range really deep, but you've kept the top end kind of wider and the low end wide. So in that 3D image we have, it looks like, if you look at it side on, it looks like this, like a U shape.
Yeah.
So it's harder to overuse it, but you definitely can overuse it. But equally, you can create more dynamics internally with the different frequencies. For example, by making one set of frequencies less dynamic, you're making the other ones more dynamic in relation to it, if that makes sense. But generally speaking, anytime it comes to compression, I tend to be quite light with it because it's very easy to overcook it and go a little bit too far and lose dynamic range, or more importantly, create problems for yourself. But yeah, does that answer your question at all, Jacob? I need to check the chat. 1 sec. Yep, okay, perfect. So what we're going to do now really quickly, I'm just going to play this through. This will take a few minutes to go through, but we're going to have a little look at actually developing more of the narrative. So like we said before, with Victor's a tour guide living in Uzhhorod and giving tours to refugees, etc. Now this is the next section. So I've already pre-cut it just so you didn't have to watch hours worth of hilarious cutting. And this is Daniel. Eugene, maybe you could speak a little bit about Daniel, and then I will hit play.
Yes, well, I already kind of introduced a little bit what he was doing, but yeah, he's a promoter and a fixer, and he had a very tough journey starting on 21st February. It never slowed down, and before he was a event organizer and a promoter, trance music especially, and was running events for over 1,000 people. He also co-ran or be involved as a promoter to one of the independent clubs that based on a factory in Ukraine. It's quite a popular thing as well in Ukraine to use or like reuse the old Soviet heritage, that is not functional anymore to the artistic needs, co-workings and etc. So he's really participating in that. And one of those factories, which is now in last 7 years occupied by different artists and etc., became a large refugee coordination center and etc. So few of the club spaces there, like Club 151, became literally a warehouse of all military help coming, for example, from abroad, or donated humanitarian help. First months, the refugees from bombed territories found the shelter in this place as well. And and he's a part of the movement that helps to organize it, but his personal mission as well. He's actually driving and traveling either alone or with the group mates, but also he participated as the fixer for international journalists, so BBC or Independent as well, and he brought them to the like as close as it's possible, legally to the front line to have conversations with the soldiers and just have a recap all over it. But and in this interview, he's talking about how everything changed from before 24th February and right now. And he's also quoting a very, or maybe not quoting, but manifesting the very reasonable phrases for, in my opinion, as Ukrainian, for the foreigners to hear, and in a way how you can help and etc. Yeah.
So yeah, what we'll do is I've pre-cut like that kind of, we've done an interview surrounding these stories, and we'll just have a listen, and then maybe either have a group discussion or between me and Eugene and whoever wants to start arranging them in a way that makes sense and putting nice spaces and gaps. So I'll just hit play, and it'll be a few minutes of just listening to stuff if everyone's fine with that. But I think it's important to get an idea of the narrative, etc. So here we go.
My name is...
I'll pause it. So I did a little transition here just so you can hear with some of that electronic music of Danik, but that was the only bit that has any kind of sound effects or anything. But
what are our hopes? So I'm really grateful.
My name is Daniel. I'm from the great city of Lviv in Western Ukraine. I'm like doing the DJing for the last 6 years. Began it like in 2016. I just fell in love in some home party into electronic music and started to practice in it. I'm 27, so I began to do an electronic music in 22. I began to do my production like just because I wanted to make some cool short videos as kind of like promotions for Zhenya's parties in 2015.
So that's like one little chunk.
For everyone involved to electronic music. Right now, like 2 months of this war passed, and it's like you could right now maybe more clearly describe what's been going on in Ukraine in the first week. I would say there was like absolute madness. Absolute madness. Like it's a good example for the madness of 40 million people.
And then that's another little chunk. So essentially the plan is to listen to all the chunks and arrange them. So here's another one.
On one of our clubs, when I have been doing the electronic music parties, the guys just decided to make a volunteer space. That was like in the first days of this war, there was a lot of saboteurs in all over Ukraine and in Lviv also. So we decided to do the Molotov cocktails in those bays. And I was kind of a driver. I have been taking these Molotov cocktails and delivering it to the checkpoints in Lviv. That was like the third day of the war.
That's another little chunk. And we've got a bigger chunk here, so I'll play this one.
That was like first maybe 7 days, maybe first week. I've been kind of a driver behind the volunteers bases in Lviv. Then we started like, I would say on a second week of the war. I just started to use my English to communicate with Western world, especially with American volunteers. And we have been like making the request for them, what they need to deliver to us, because from the first weeks, it was like some funny situation. Europeans, especially like Europeans, have been sending us the food, and we have been like we had a lot of conversations with them, just like saying them, guys, we need weapons, not the food. We need weapons, the defense ammunition, at least if it's possible. So I was like maybe for the second and third week of this war, and on the 21st day of this war, I got a suggestion to drive with Western journalists to like on a trip to Ukraine to film some hot points, some like hospitals, like how Ukrainians is living on the places close to war. By a plan, it was the trip maybe for 6 days, but I spent in this trip 1 month. I have been in almost all Ukraine with journalists from United States and Japan. We have been in a lot of cities. Every city has kind of its own profile. I've seen the dead bodies. I've seen all of this massacre which Russians made in the Kiev region, in Bucha, Irpin, just injured cities, like all buildings have been destroyed. I've been maybe like in 10 cities in this trip, supporting journalists, fixing for them like all of interviews with, for example, people who lost their homes and how they're like feeling about this war. We're like have been in hospitals, speaking with wounded soldiers. I've seen a lot, and then traveled in Ukraine a lot. Then I would say that was like really a good and nice trip, because in reality, the mental condition in Ukraine is far, far better than like you could see the image on internet.
So I think that chunk is a fairly important chunk. I think that kind of means creates like the basis of the narrative with Danik. And we'll just keep going through just so you guys have the full picture of what we're working with. I know it might be a little bit long and lengthy, but we'll go for the next little chunk.
This is the maybe clearest example of the war you could imagine. So it's not like a conflict. It's not kind of like some hybrid conflict. It's not as a real war with all missiles, with destructions, with tanks, with hard weapons, with dead bodies, with everything it could be possible in a war we have. So I've seen a lot of this stuff on my eyes. Actually, like in Lviv, we just had maybe 3 or 4 launching of the rockets. But when I was like closer to the front line, I've seen, for example, the highway from Kiev to Lviv. The highway nearby Kiev was captured by Russians for 2 weeks. And I've seen the pictures from it, just that Russian tanks with that Z letter. What was like shocking for me the most, for me, war, it was like, some kind of dirty stuff with everything is destroyed, the pictures of absolute destruction. But you're riding on a good, like European kind of highway. Everything is nice and good, just dead Russian tanks and just like absolutely destroyed gas stations. That was so strange for me. It looks like you're driving the Europe, developed country, but you see some dead Russian tanks, BMPs. It was so strange to see, but it's reality.
So that's another little chunk, and I'll just go through all of them. But if you have any ideas about or comments, feel free to chip in at any point as well.
Hard to answer for your question. Everybody in Ukraine was knowing, like from the 2014, from the war in Donbass, that like Putin wanna take Ukraine because he's like a historic fanatic, and everybody knows in Ukraine that Russia just stole the concept, the historical concept of their country from Kiev and Rus. So actually, the name of state, Rus, begins from Kiev, and Russia is like kind of a country without the legs. Legs, the beginning of their country is in Ukraine. So they stole our history, and Kiev was founded like 700 years before Moscow. So
yeah.
So Jacob asking, is there like some sound in a recording? And I thought there's none, but actually I've heard something like
Like, is it the crackling and popping? Like,
No, it looks to no. It looks to me like something like moving, like a car moving or something. No?
The beginning of their country is in Ukraine. So they stole our history.
wait, is it this drilling sound? Because I think there's someone. There's this.
So that's your sound,
Yeah, sorry, no, I think there's someone doing some drilling.
Jacob.
Thing.
You got the answer, right, mate? Sorry, like as I remember, we recorded it in a proper silence, like so. Okay,
yeah,
that's
sorted.
No,
I've closed the window. It's
sorry.
No, it's all good. Good ears.
Russia is like kind of a country without the legs. Legs, the beginning of their country is in Ukraine. So they stole our history, and Kiev was founded like 700 years before Moscow. So that's the main case in Putin's head. And before the war, it was kind of 2 or 3 months, the articles from Western intelligence that like Russia is planning the invasion of Ukraine. But the problem is that the Western intelligences have been like counting just the number of tanks, comparing with the number of Russian tanks. I would say the prevention of this war could be possible if maybe some intelligence of the world had just like interviewed Ukrainians before this war and just asked Ukrainians what you will do in this war, because everybody here had been knowing that like everybody gonna be making the resistance, but everybody had like making the prediction of 2 or 3 days in Ukraine falls. So that's why Putin decided that that's gonna be like the easy game, and then you have seen what you've seen.
And then this is the final little block here.
Actually, like more than a half of electronic music scene in Lviv are based in Zavodska Street. And when the war begins, like all of the spaces in Zavodska Street just began to work as volunteers bases. In Club 151, there was like from the beginning, there was the Molotov cocktails production, but when we realized that in Western Ukraine we don't need it, guys are like changing their profile to making the smoke bombs and sending them to military guys. A lot of military guys have been ordering those smoke bombs. Also, it's like still being the place for receiving the humanitarian aid. I was also one club when I have been doing my parties. Also, they just started from the beginning of the war, making there the military trainings. Like the main profile is receiving supplies and resending them to Ukraine, because Lviv is kind of a logistics hub.
I remember this is the last bit.
I want to really thank to all of volunteers of the world, especially those guys who arrived to Ukraine. I've seen the guys from US who have been like driving to the front lines. Right now, only actions matter. Nobody needs the position. Position doesn't changing anything. It's a fight between light and darkness, and you just could not choose a dark way, so everybody chooses the light way.
Cool. So that's the full kind of reducted version of Daniel's interview. So I didn't want to go through the full hour-long one, and it would take hours of cutting through it. So I did it in my free time. But there's kind of, I guess, we'll talk a little bit and have a discussion about like the narrative arch and kind of the concept of the podcast. So in terms of what Daniel's talking about, we have him talking about his own background in electronic music, and then relating that to how that helped him get into volunteering, and in general the response of the Ukrainian electronic scene to volunteering. And he talks a little bit over here about the clubs that have repurposed themselves to be volunteer bases, doing military training, etc., etc. But then we also have this section, which I think is very important, and it's kind of about what war actually feels like, because to me, what this podcast really wants to do is I want to create a snapshot of those people's stories who have experienced this and actually describe it in the way they would like, rather than the way that necessarily traditional forms of media are describing it or showing it. So being able to actually take the emotional standpoint of how it feels and how surprising it is, and these things that as a human you're curious about and think about that would never really be reported in the news to that extent, I think is an important element of this podcast. And then finally, there's one other section he talks about that I've forgotten. I think it's.
But when I was like closer to.
Oh, and then he talks a little bit more about like war prevention, and then it becomes a bit more generalist in terms of talking about the world's, how this perception of Ukraine and Ukrainian strength in turn helped cause this war. And I think it's quite important to talk about, especially coming from someone who's been on the front lines and seen a lot of what is happening. So I really, like I said, I already did a little edit of them, and I re-exported them. So I'll quickly show you, before we get to arranging narrative, one more little technical thing. So in Reverb, when I imported this, it was actually a stereo file. So if I show you right now, and I go to item settings, I have it selected to take channel mono. So when I actually brought it in, it looked like this, and all of them look like this because they were one file, but they were this little stereo file. So as you can see, I don't know if we've talked about this before, but this is mono, where you've got a singular audio source, and this is stereo. You can see that there's a left channel and a right channel. Now, this is actually just a mono source, and I know that because when we recorded it, it was a mono source. It's just that when I exported it, it exported as a stereo file. So in order to not have to waste, for example, processing power when you're putting plugins, because when you process stereo files, it uses twice the processing as mono files because it needs to do the compression, for example, to the left channel and the right channel. So to save on that, and just for good practice, because also it's a vocal, I would much rather it be mono. It makes sense for it to be mono. I right click on it and get to item settings. And in here, this is where it defaults to take channel mode normal. And I just go to take channel mode left. It doesn't actually matter if it's left or right, because in this case, left and right are identical because it was an original mono source made stereo. There is no difference between left and right. So I just selected left, and now you can see it switched back to 1. So that was just like an additional little tip if you're trying to change between stereo and mono files, or split a stereo file into 2 mono, etc. That's a little useful way. But now I think what's important is to arrange this. So in general, it has a nice flow. The main thing that jumps out immediately that I think we should deal with first is this little last section where he's talking about Zavotska Street. I'm sorry if I've pronounced that terribly wrong.
No, it's all good.
So that I think definitely belongs with some of the section here where we were talking about electronic music. And let's just see. So I'll just put them here. And if we hit play again, this is talking about...
I'm 27, so
this is his kind of bio background. Then we have...
You know, right now, like 2 months of this war passed, and it's like you could right now maybe more clearly describe what's been going on in Ukraine in the first week.
So this is kind of talking about the chaos that you feel.
One of our clubs, when I have been doing the electronic music parties, the guys just decided to make a volunteer space. That was like in the first days of this war, there was a lot of saboteurs in all over Ukraine and in
so in terms of arrangement, I think what might make the most sense is after this section,
all over Ukraine,
we have the bit where he's talking about Zavotska Street and all the different clubs, and then it goes into his own personalized story about volunteering. So it's kind of interlacing the 2 sections. You have his personal bio and his own personal view of the war, then a little bit more of kind of factual, still his own personal experiences of it, but a bit more factual, talking about the volunteering that's happening through the electronic scene. And then it goes back to his more personalized, what specific volunteering has he been doing. And I kind of like that when I create narratives, I kind of like this little jumping between the 2 because it creates dynamics, and especially if you can do it in a nice and interesting way where they still interrelate between the 2, you're creating the 2 viewpoints that kind of exist simultaneously. But especially in this format, it's very hard because you can't necessarily control what people say. If you're in like we said, the talk show format where it's one person interviewing another person, it's very easy to have the conversation flow because you're essentially using the conversation as is, and you can, through the questions you're asking, inform how it's going to be. This type of podcast format that we've gone for is much more labor intensive because it's super reductive. It's taking a big chunk, like an hour interview, and making 10 minutes or so from it, which I think is really good for this workshop, but it's also the way I like to do stuff, just the way I think you can get more interesting, condensed information. But it does mean we have the challenges here. putting together and making separate parts seem cohesive and seamless can be very challenging. But that's just, I think it just comes with practice and repeatedly doing it. So let's just have a play now, going from this section here, and we'll look for the right kind of pause. In the first workshop, we were talking about kind of speaking cadences. When someone speaks, there's a certain feel as to where the next word is supposed to go. And it's really important when you're cutting these parts as part of making them feel cohesive, as well as the content of them, it needs to be relevant from one section to another. It's also the pauses and the tonality that it changes on. And that can be very tricky and takes a little while. So let's have a listen here.
Also, so we decided to do the Molotov cocktails in those bass. And I was kind of a driver. I have been taking this Molotov cocktails and delivering it to the checkpoints in Lviv. That was like the third day of the war. Actually, like more than a half of electronic music scene in Lviv.
So I think that came in a little bit late, and it's very hard, I guess, for me to describe why I feel like it was late. But if I play it here, I'll almost count it in my head or feel like there's a pulse that continues after he stops speaking. And wherever that pulse lands again after a comfortable silence or a comfortable break is where I feel like he should start speaking. So we'll do it again to check.
Of cocktails and delivering it to the checkpoints in Lviv. That was like the third day of the war. Actually, like more than a half of electronic music scene in Lviv.
So to me, that's quite a nice spacing, and it kind of feels relevant. And it leaves an ambiguity because you can't tell whether he said that as the very next thing in the sentence or if that's actually a separate part that you put in. And I personally quite like that effect. So now we have this kind of structure where he's talking about bio. And in fact, what we can do, maybe it'll help for everyone as well to be able to see, is if we go up here, I can just add a marker, and I'll just do it this way so you guys can see. Insert marker here. So you can just go there, or you can just tap M. And I'm just going to name this Danik. I'm just going to copy that because everything will be Danik bio. And then this section is...
right now, like 2 months of this war passed.
Okay, then I'm going to add another one, and I'm just going to rename it. And it's a labor intensive, but this is kind of chaos feeling. And it's more just for myself to be able to orientate how the narrative is going. And then this is
doing
this is the introduction to. So I'm just going to put this and go intro to EL. I'm just going to go EM for electronic music volunteering. I'm just going to put vol because otherwise it will be ridiculously long. And then this will be again. I'm just going to put electronic music vol continue. And then we have this section.
The volunteers bases in Lviv.
And then this is the personal help section. So because of the way I tend to build any kind of podcasty based thing or narrative based specific just audio, I like to, probably because of my background as an audio engineer, I really like to bring in lots of audio, like sound effects or ambiences and little sound bites just to create more of a rich immersion. And that's just me personally, so it's not required. But what that means is when I'm cutting together the little narrative parts, I need to think in my head, what would I potentially like? Because the thing with audio is you always want to work left to right. Because, for example, if I finish all this and they're all perfectly aligned and then I need to move one thing, you need to go back and move every audio file to the right of it, to this side of the screen, closer as well. You can't just move the one thing because otherwise you change the internal timing of the phrases, or the sync that you had where a sound effect landed perfectly doesn't land perfectly anymore, etc., etc. So it's kind of tricky because it will be a bit of back and forth, especially when you're starting out. But I like to kind of think about any sound effects. So now going from this section to talking about Daniel's new volunteering, I think it might be nice to have just a small transitional effect, even if it's something like a car effect, because he's talking about driving multifocals or something, just to create these transitional breaks so it's not just constant voice. Because at least just me personally, I find that can get monotonous quite quickly. So what we'll do is have a listen again and think about what sound and what sort of gap size we would like, just roughly.
Making there the military trainings. Like the main profile is receiving supplies and resending them to Ukraine, because Lviv is kind of a logistics hub.
Okay.
That was like first maybe 7 days, maybe first week. I've been kind of a driver behind the volunteer spaces in Lviv.
Okay, so what I think, because it ends with logistics and taking stuff across the country here, and then starts with Danik talking about driving supplies across the country, I think the perfect transitional sound is to get some sort of, whether it's truck or general car driving noise, and placing it between the two, because you're kind of, at least for me, tying them conceptually to the same thing, but it allows you to be a bit more abrupt with your cuts, so that the audience can notice this is a different part of the conversation, because you've almost removed that space. When you think about a podcast, you kind of imagine to an extent someone sitting in a space. And if you have these transitional sounds, it's the equivalent of maybe a camera cut to a B-roll shot, you know, if you're thinking in like a video terminology, where you have an interview, and then if you cut to the shot of a castle or whatever it might be, in this case, yeah, a truck, it creates that change of scenery, so that when you cut back to another part, it's acceptable for that person to be in a new place, or it's acceptable for that person to have moved position. Whereas if that just happened from one cut of an interview to another visually, it would be very strange. And I think it's kind of the same in audio, but it feels like you can maybe get away with more, but it's important to consider it. So I'll just check the rough length, and we won't do it right now, but I'll put a marker in here. So if I do this and I will rename it, this is just kind of the way I work. And I'll go add, I'll put driving SFX, just so I know and I can come back to it. And once I've done it, I will delete the marker. But and then we'll just check the rough distance.
Resending them to Ukraine, because Lviv is kind of a logistics hub.
And I think around about here is probably where we want the vocals to come in. So it'd be a case of dragging that back a little bit. And then here you've got this nice transitional bit, just like a little small bit, and it adds to the immersion. So it's kind of like a double function. So now we've got this section, which is talking about Danik's personal volunteering. So I'll add another marker, just put it along so that it doesn't cover it, and call this Danik personal vol. And then let's check the final.
Not like a conflict. It's not kind of like some hybrid conflict. It's not. I say that was like really a good and nice trip, because in reality.
Okay, so I think these can actually stitch together nicely again, because they're conceptually relevant. He's talking about the feeling of war and the trip. He's talking about what war feels like, but then he's leading in with a story about traveling around that kind of gives the personal experience as to why he has these opinions. So to me, by talking about his journey and what he's done as a volunteer and what he's seen, it creates a mandate in a way for the views that you're then going to hear in the second part. And I think they also sound quite natural flowing from them. Let's have a look.
In reality, the mental condition in Ukraine is far, far better than like you could see the image on internet. This is maybe.
Yeah, so we can actually make this closer. I think we can almost tie this together to see like one singular piece. So what I will do is move. I'm just going to drag this to be shorter, and then I'm just going to take this, put them together. Actually, shorten them a little bit. No, wrong way. There, shorten it, and drag it in. And as you can see, as it joins, it creates its own little crossfade. And then I will just move that crossfade over here.
And like you could see the image on internet. This is the maybe clearest example of the war you could imagine. So
yeah, there we go. So to me, that sounds very natural. I kind of hear that. I don't actually hear that as a jump necessarily. So I'm going to delete this marker now, because that was an old marker from before when I was doing the same thing. And I'm just going to put another marker here and just call this what the war feels like. And I'm just going to put Danik in the front so that we know. And then we have this little section. And I'm also just going through, when I was pre-editing it, I left all these sections of silence just so that I could easily find, they weren't predefined as how long they should be. They were just there so I could find the chunks of audio, the blocks that I can then arrange. And it also saves it getting very messy, because, for example, what you don't see here is that there's probably 20 or 30 different cuts inside of each of these blocks. And if I wanted to then arrange that whole block, I would need to make sure I selected every single one with like holding shift and clicking, dragging around. and make sure I don't accidentally move a single fade or any of these things, which are very easy to miss because they're very intricate and small, and if you're not paying attention. So by doing this, it's not only good to clean up, like have a fresh slate, bringing it in and just seeing this is what I'm working with, but it's also practically good because you're not going to make those errors that you go down the line and you listen back to the podcast at the end of the day when you could work and go, wait a minute, there's just a huge crossfade over these two clips and I just hear two people's voices at once, or anything like that. It's kind of, you commit to it and follow forward. So I quite like that way of working in general, that you kind of commit to something and then go forward with it, rather than especially with digital audio, there are far too many options, and you have the ability to, sorry, you have the ability to change so many different parameters that it can kind of get debilitating in a way. And I think, like this, for example, exporting and re-importing is a nice way of committing to yourself and just giving yourself kind of a box. And I think that applies to almost all creative activity as well. You need to give yourself some form of box from which you use the constraints to be creative, because otherwise it's very unwilding or hard to grasp the best way to approach it when you have 100 different options. So we had this bit here, which is what the wall feels like. And if we have a listen, let's see how it ends in terms of content and what the next chunk is.
BMPs, it was so strange to see, but it's reality.
Okay, and then we go to this section.
You know, hard to answer for your question. Everybody in Ukraine was knowing, like, from the 2014, from the war in Donbass, that like Putin wanna take Ukraine because he's like a historic fanatic, and everybody knows in Ukraine that Russia just stole the concept, the historical concept of their country from Kiev and Rus. So actually, the name of state, Rus, begins from Kiev, and you know, Russia is like.
Okay, so this is kind of like a kind of historical analysis as to why the war happened, and then it ends, if my memory is correct, we'll check, but with a kind of sum up of the fact that Western media, Western military and intelligence in general underestimated Ukraine's abilities by not actually getting their own views. It helped in turn cause the war because it created a kind of pseudo confidence for Russia that it would be easy, etc. So I think this is really important, and I think the best place for it in my head right now is kind of where it is. It's just my only fear is that this is kind of a change of subject that then we immediately end the next section with. But let me just check one more time and have a listen.
Everybody had like making the prediction of 2 or 3 days and Ukraine falls. So that's why Putin decided that that's going to be like the easy game. And then you have seen what you've seen. Just like interviewed Ukrainians before this war and just asked Ukrainians what.
Okay, so the potential is we can either keep this chunk here after what war feels like.
I actually it fits in my head, to be honest.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I think the two options would be either there or before he starts talking about war. But I think the flow we had here was quite nice, and then it'll interrupt how it interlaces. So I think we can kind of stitch these together.
So strange to see, but it's reality.
And I think having a bit of a pause here, a little bit shorter than that, but this sort of a pause, because it is kind of clear it's a different conversation. He actually even starts the sentence with talking about me asking a question, which I personally don't have a problem with. Some people might say, oh, but you didn't actually ask a question, but I don't find it to be too jarring, and it kind of it seems to fit naturally into his speech pattern. And that's something I think with podcasting specifically, or any kind of audio-only narrative stuff, the way the person uses language and the cadence that they speak, but also the sort of grammar or kind of internal speech patterns can determine what you can get away with and what you can't, because some stuff can feel very natural for one type of speaker, and for another speaker it might feel truncated if you don't have a lead-in question or a more contextualized bit of information from beforehand. So yeah, I think you kind of develop like a very intimate relationship with the voice that you're editing when it comes to podcasting. So let's just have a look at this time again.
But it's reality. You know, hard to answer.
So I think this can be a bit closer. I'm roughly using these bar divisions that you can see, which are usually actually for music, but I've kind of look at the timing, and when I hit play and I see where the cursor feels like it should land, I kind of align up where that cursor was with the bars.
But it's reality. Hard to answer for your question. Everybody in Ukraine was knowing, like, from the 2014, from the war.
Yeah, perfect. And then the final bit we just need to put, and this is a kind of really nice little sign-off bit that we have. It's him kind of thanking volunteers.
I want to really thank to all of volunteers of the world, especially those guys who arrived to Ukraine. I've seen the guys from US who have been like driving to the front lines. Right now, only actions matter. Nobody needs the position. Position doesn't changing anything. It's a fight between light and darkness, and you just could not choose a dark way. So everybody chooses the light way.
Yeah, so I think that's, like, to me, that's a really nice way of signing off. And we'll just check the ending of this section going.
So that's why Putin decided that that's going to be like the easy game, and then you have seen what you've seen. I want to really thank.
Yeah, I think, again, a nice kind of bigger pause like that, something kind of like this, is quite nice. And this is not the end of the whole podcast episode. What this is we've kind of been doing the multiple stories interlaced. So there's still a few more people that we need to bring in, and I'm going to pre-edit and drag in. But this is the end of Danik's story in a way. So what we've done is we started with Victoria. Victoria is very short because the plan is, for those of you that weren't there in the first one, she's a double refugee from Ukraine. She's currently in Spain. And her story kind of underpins the whole context of this podcast, in the sense that all of these stories relate to how this war affects Ukrainian people. And she is a very good example of how how as a Ukrainian she's been affected being a refugee twice, how it's changed her life. So the plan is to use her small segments here that we've taken from it to interlace and contextualize the other people's stories together. So we still have, I think, 2 or 3 more other stories that we're going to cut up and put it together. But I think this is the kind of chunk of Danik's section. And what we'll need to do next is kind of layer in some of those sound effects and just get a bit more creative with it, because I really like immersive podcast, because I don't know, I enjoy nerdy audio and multiple different angles rather than just the pure narrative, like the information narrative. I think you can create the 2 parallel narrative lines through sound effects as well as the narrative sides. But yeah, does anyone have any questions or suggestions or anything at all that they wanna ask, etc., about any of that? No, that's all good. Perfect.
I mean, I would because I participate in a pre-production, so for me, I would say dialogue-wise, probably the Danik's interview was the most solid and confident regarding the topic and regarding maybe how to put in a place what he actually meant. And yeah, comparing then, for example, Victoria's or Victor's or Lisa's, it's much more empathic and emotional, while Danik is example of very strict, straightforward, carpe diem actions. And that makes the text and the overall message, I think, much more audible in a way that is like, it's continuous, regarding the topic and regarding the emotion and the flow. And you can also really feel it vocally as well, which I personally really like as a very phonetic oriented person. That
yeah, no, his voice is it's like a very nice, strong voice to work with. Like you barely even need to do any compression or anything. You can actually see the dynamics of his voice. In fact, it was so loud. Actually, it's a good thing to maybe mention from a technical aspect again. I pulled down, you see, for example, if you look at Victor, there's not this kind of grayed out area here. And what this is it can be called clip gain. It's the volume of the clip itself. So if I pull it down, you'll see the actual audio changes in volume. Because Danik's audio was quite strong, louder than the others, I actually just pulled the entire clip down. I think it was like 2.9 dB roughly. And that you can do on any of them. You just hover up at the top of the clip, for example, and you get this little cursor with a line. And if you drag it down, you get your clip gain. Another way to do that, if you can't manage to get that little thing to show up, is you can double click. No, right click. No, it is double click. I'm sorry. And in here you have this little this little volume section. And here it does the same sort of thing. But to me, it makes a lot more sense to do it like this, because you can also visually see it. It appears here, and you know if you've trimmed your clips. And this can be equally useful. We were talking about compression at the beginning quite a bit. And if you don't really want to add a compressor, or maybe you don't have a really powerful laptop and or a laptop that really struggles just to run Reaper, basically, instead of necessarily bringing in a compressor and there's just one section that's too loud, but you also don't want to write the volume automation, because as you'll see probably later on, when there's a few downsides to writing automation, that it kind of stops you from being able to move faders later on because they're already programmed to have a certain way. You can use this clip gain feature to trim, let's say, for example, here you can see in this purple clip of Victor, if I zoom in, it's generally fairly stable, but then there's this section here that's quite loud. What you could do is cut it, so I'm just using S to cut around that clip, and just simply bring just this one down a little bit. And that kind of acts as a compressor to an extent. You need to be careful with it because you don't want to do huge changes and hear massive jumps in the voice. But it's just a really useful, and it's good practice as well, because it means you're hitting, as in the audio is reaching the plugin, the effect, at a good level. You're not going to have incredibly quiet and then so loud that it starts distorting inside of the plugin. So like from a technical terminology, it would be called gain staging. And you kind of want roughly, the gain staging I aim for is about -16 or -12. And what I mean by that is if I bring my mixer up, and you'll see now on Victor's channel when I hit play, he's a little bit louder.
Action,
as you can see,
small
he's
button will change
between
the
6
whole
and
perspective.
18. And again, it's got to be very approximate, because especially with speech, it changes a lot. You know, it's very hard to gauge. But when it comes to recording, if you had an interface with a microphone or something, you can adjust the input level that you're recording on. Then I would aim for like -16 probably, with peaks hitting like -12. It's not the end of the world if they go over. The only thing you really don't want is it to hit 0. If it clips, then you can't undo it. Everything else is okay. But the reason I go for lower is because I have all that space that if something suddenly happens, it's still not ruined. Because yeah, nowadays, especially in this sort of context, when you have an interview, it's very hard to go back and get the same content. It's still, even in the context of music, it's tricky, because if you have a really nice take and then it distorts, it's kind of ruined. But you can drop in and fix that section, because it's, you know, usually the person has learned the song. You can replay the sections, whereas with an interview, it's very free for all. It's much harder to get someone to repeat a question the same way they did, and for even in general, like the interviewing environment, for the room to feel the same way, so that person wants to talk about it in the way that they did. But in this case, when we're using Zencaster, it does an automatic gain adjustment. It's like Zoom. So when you're recording like we did here, we just set up, and the software kind of does everything for you. So it's fairly simple and straightforward. But yeah, so that's kind of the general narrative that we've built up here so far, is talking about, we have the experience of someone whose life has been completely upturned and moved multiple times due to wars and multiple. And then we have the section here of Victor, and Victor talking about his work as helping refugees that come to Uzhhorod, which is, for those of you who don't know, kind of the main refugee city, because it's in the most western parts of Ukraine, kind of the safest part, if you will. And talking about how he's been helping them relocate to there, or again, go further afield to seek refuge in other countries. So that's kind of working directly with refugees from the people who are fleeing as a volunteer. And now we've put in Danix, and from Danix you can hear he's working more from someone who's in Ukraine, going closer to the front lines to help both journalists in terms of representing, being able to show the atrocities to the media, but equally actually going, instead of helping people going to safety, he's putting himself in the the danger seat to be able to do the important volunteering, like delivering supplies, etc. So the whole
Exactly.
goal, narrative-wise, is to create like a really balanced image of all the different cogs in the machine, all the different actions people can take, and try and represent it in like a realistic way, a way that's not sensationalized, trying to show any over-the-top things. It's more something I really would like it to be something that you wouldn't find very normally in terms of turning on the news and seeing someone's story, because I don't think the news would play this unless someone had their leg blown off as a volunteer going to the front line, or like something incredibly sensationalized. This is what actually everyday people in Ukraine are doing together.
It's very hard to. I mean, I totally agree and understand what you're saying. It's just mentally hard to accept that fact that 90 days of the biggest world war in the 21st century is not sensational enough,
Like,
it's like I hate media. I'm ex-journalist. I hate it.
No, I completely agree, and I think that's kind of. Oh, sorry.
No. I'm just.
That's kind of the
upset.
goal of the podcast, is to be counter to that in an extent, and that's also the goal of the workshops, is to allow people to tell stories in a way that they want to on their terms, rather than requiring meeting some sort of sensational standard or having some sort of commercial selling point or anything like that. It's much more to like democratize information and invitation making and sharing.
I agree, but Sam, there is also this is very unfortunate thing that Ukraine have so much of a people that can provide you such a clear information with a very critical and analytical and both sides opinion and etc. But we don't have enough people who can do it in English. Our new generation, the problem is that they actually the message from Ukraine to the Western world would be so much clearer if obviously if we would cancel this Russian language 20 years ago in the schools and would add another English lesson instead.
Yeah,
it's very upset.
No, I understand completely. But I think that kind of summarizes where we're at in terms of the podcast now, and we still have a few more interviews we're going to bring in, etc., and just keep going. But are there any questions or comments, anything like that at all?
Jacob had a comment in a chat regarding would we consider to use small amounts of music as opposed to special effects, or maybe just ambient stuff?
Yes.
Keep going.
Yeah, so I actually thought about this, and I had pre-downloaded some stuff that I never got around to bringing in today. But especially in terms of drones or music, I think it's very strange to draw the line between sound effects and ambience and music, because, for example, riser-y type effects or drone-y type stuff, it's very ambiguous if it's kind of experimental music or if it's sound effects. But I think that it'd be very, very nice. In fact, I actually spent the other day trawling through some kind of Ukrainian folk stuff to see if there were any interesting folk things we could sample, and I would like to find that. I'll probably do something with Eugene to find some stuff that's relevant and makes sense.
I actually have access. I actually have access to maybe 70 years of ethnical vocals recording in Western Ukraine. So Transcarpathia, Lviv Oblast, and Riven Oblast, Ternopil Oblast. Alina Pash, my friend, the girl from Eurovision, for her previous album, she was in contact with the archivists, people who
ethnic music archivists.
Yes, this group of this segment of people, and I have access to
amazing,
very, very old, some of them are not in a good quality, but something authentic that not alive anymore.
That would be amazing. So I'm definitely, I think it'd be really nice to incorporate those musical elements, and then less traditional music elements in the sense of kind of ambient drone-y type stuff. And I really wanted to incorporate that, but I'm trying to keep it open source. So I found a whole bunch on Free Sound Bible, or some one of those sites, and I was going to put them in, but I'm slightly concerned in terms of bringing them in, making it cheesy in a way, because they're low rumbly stuff and verging on the edge of horror. Some of them are really nicely done. I think I can definitely find spots for them, but I'm slightly scared, especially because it's like sensitive topic. I don't want to make it cheesy when someone's talking about war because it's already dramatic. But I do
You
want
have to be
find a way.
tasteful with it.
Yeah, exactly. But I really do want to find a way of bringing it in nicely. And if I was doing this not open source, I'd probably do something like plug in my synth and record like bits of synthy sounds. But I'm just trying to keep it open so it's like accessible.
It's still much better if you have a dramatic approach to such topic than sarcastic, so like I think from empathical approach, like it cannot be really too cheesy, because like, I mean, what we recognize as cheesy, something the like a dramatic story, mom that lost her child and her husband is dramatic story, not cheesy story. And the sounds that like adding a layered sounds that just like trying to like kind of design the story and just make it a little bit more even more concrete or even more audible or visual, if you want to imagine this situation. I don't think that's in the context of such big crime of humanity, using the dramatic elements which we recognize as cheesy just because we're outsider designers, sound designers, but actually like it's a big tool that helps to like put the message in a more applicable and also familiar way, because as not the contributors, as as a consumers, right? We still prefer to consume something that we already seen in one or the other way. And like, some of the like, there is some tools in the cinematography. I know more from a cinematography than from a podcasting, obviously, but still, like it's not always bad to use a familiar tools or familiar arrangements if you're trying to talk, if you're trying to build up the dramatic effect like of the message. So I would like, I'm 50-50 about this. I don't think it's that.
Okay.
I think it's a balance.
I think cheesy is very it's very wide and controversial word, because it's like it's a preference, what you find cheesy. Is it cheesy or sweet? Is it like, is it childy or cheesy? Like, so like, it's a very wide palette. And like, when I think I personally disagree with opinion that like the widely or common used elements, such as like rumble of the apocalyptic film used in a war context, is something that make it looks like a little bit artificial. No. Like,
okay. Yeah, no,
I think so.
Yeah, no, I'm on the fence with it because I really want to. I think it can help vectorize it, and I think maybe what we can do is next workshop do stuff specific like the aesthetics of background sound and do a little bit of like bringing in those elements and just have like a discussion about it as well, because I think a big part of it is not just putting them in, but also like thinking about them and the conceptual side of it. But yeah, I think that's kind of everything. If everyone's happy, if there's any more questions or anything around that.
Sorry to interrupt, if I may. It was because I just wanted to mention I need to go, but the thing is, it's really quite interesting, and really, you're really good at do a good job, Sam. Good job, and the whole thing is like really interesting. Like, if I would definitely like to be more involved in some sort of way. I mean, like Jim, we can get in touch in some sort of way, I like, I'm all ears, and that's really dope. Like, because unfortunately I just need to go to Edinburgh today, so
I'm also going to Edinburgh today, unfortunately.
Oh really?
yeah.
So but yeah, so just I need to go because my bus is like it's going pretty soon. So really cool. So like, enjoy, guys. I don't want to disturb you, so let's keep in touch, and definitely I will try to join the next sessions.
Amazing. Awesome.
Perfect.
Well,
Thank you
see
so
you
much,
next
guys.
time. Thank you, man.
Cheers.
I'll see you soon. Ciao. Cool.
Right.
But yeah, if anyone has any more questions, I'm happy to answer them, but if not, we're all good.
You're my favorite audio nerd, Sam.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll quickly stop the recording, 2 seconds.